Well, hello again. My name is Alister McGrath, and I'm the author of Christian Theology and Introduction, which is now in 6th edition, marking the 25th anniversary of its publication. And this presentation is developed to help you use this book. I'm recording these presentations at my home in Oxfordshire. It's April 2020 and the United Kingdom is in lockdown because of the coronavirus pandemic. So I can't record this lecture in an Oxford library or an Oxford lecture hall. So I hope you'll enjoy the very informal feel to them. And it's a really nice privilege to be able to speak to you in this way. So again, let me remind you, this textbook has 18 chapters divided into 3 parts. And so we come now to the first part, which has 4 chapters. This introduces landmarks in the history of Christian theology in a very accessible way, and aims to provide a reliable and accessible overview of the key theologians, debates and schools of thought that have had influence over the development of Christian theology in this period. And this is really helpful as you try to get your mind around how Christian theology has developed. So basically, these opening chapters aim to familiarize you with these landmarks as quickly and painlessly as possible. So let's talk about the first chapter of Christian theology, which introduces you to one of these landmarks, the theology of the early church. It is often described as the patristic age or the patristic period, and it's usually taken to refer to the period from the closing of the New Testament to the Council of Chalcedon. That's roughly from 100 to 451. And the Council of Chalcedon is often cited as a landmark, as it marks the resolution of early Christian discussion of the identity and significance of Christ, and it's widely seen as bringing about closure of some very highly important debates and reflections. But of course, some would say this early church period extends to the 8th century, so we need to go beyond Chalcedon. But for my purposes, we're really focusing on the period 100 to 451. Now, this is an enormously exciting and creative period in the history of Christian theology. And what I need to say is, right from the outset, theology was seen as integral to the life of faith. It was closely linked with spirituality, preaching and catechesis. And one of the points I want to identify with you is that we need to understand how Christianity expanded very rapidly during this period of the early church. We have, for example, the great cities of Antioch and Alexandria in the east, and Rome and Carthage in the west. And there's a map in this chapter, here it is, which may help you work out where all these places are. And one of the things Christianity was discovering was that it could interact with classical Greek philosophy, with late classical antique culture, and hold its own. And we see a number of things happening during this period. For example, a consensus emerges on the works that are to be included in the canon of the New Testament. And also, of course, in 313, there was the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine, here depicted by Rubens, and Christianity now became a recognized religion within the Roman Empire. It could do more than just survive now. It could grow and play a part in public debate. Now, many students of theology find this period difficult to approach. Why? Well, because its philosophical and cultural background is very different to what we are used to. And certainly that was my experience as a student back in the 1970s. I found myself struggling to get my head around some of the ideas of the early church period. And so I spend a lot of time in this book helping you to understand what's going on, giving you far more explanation than I ever received, precisely because I know just how important this is. It will help you to make sense of the key developments and achievements of this really important period. So in this opening chapter, we look at some of the great theological developments of the patristic age. It maps this intellectual landscape, identifying some important theologians and debates, and these keep getting referenced in contemporary debate, so it's really relevant. Theology keeps referencing its past. You need to know about this to be able to take part in discussions. So let me tell you about 4 of these theologians that we mention in this chapter. There are a lot more than this. First of all, Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus is thought to have been born in Smyrna in Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey, although he subsequently settled in Rome and became bishop of the southern French city of Lyon around 178. And his most significant work is entitled Against the Heresies. It's a major defense of the Christian understanding of salvation, and especially a defense of the role of tradition in remaining faithful to the apostolic witness in the face of non-Christian readings of the New Testament. Arian is saying it's not enough to read the New Testament. You need to know how the apostles interpreted the New Testament, what they meant when they wrote those books. And that's why continuity between the church and the apostles really is important. A second theologian is Origen. Origen was based in the great city of Alexandria during the first half of the 3rd century and is noted for many things, including his use of allegorical interpretation. This means looking beneath the surface meaning of Scripture and finding its deeper spiritual meaning. We'll have a lot more to say about Origen when we look at questions of biblical interpretation in chapter 6. Our third theologian is Athanasius of Alexandria. Now, here's our 17th century icon, which might tell us what he looks like. And this 4th century theologian was of major importance, especially in relation to Christology. His book on the incarnation of the Word remains a classic. You will see it cited today. It's a powerful defense of the idea of the incarnation, namely the belief that God assumed human nature in the person of Jesus Christ. And this issue proved to be of central importance in the Arian Controversy, in which Athanasius made a major contribution to the defense of orthodoxy. And we'll look at this in more detail in the chapter dealing with the development of Christology. And finally, we look at Augustine of Hippo, here seen in a 15th century work by Filippo Lippi. Augustine is probably one of the greatest and most influential theologians of the Church and is regularly referenced today in major theological debates. And one of his great contributions was to achieve a synthesis of Christian thought, supremely in his treatise on the City of God. And Augustine made key contributions, I think, to 3 major areas of Christian theology: the doctrine of the Church and the sacraments, arising from the Donatist Controversy, the doctrine of grace, arising from the Pelagian Controversy, and the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, there were several developments during the period of the early Church that had significant impact on theological reflection. And these are discussed in detail, but let me just note 2 of them. One of them is the emergence of creeds as communal confessions of faith. And certainly these creeds were very important. The 2 most important were the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, both of which emerged as public, authorized statements of the Christian faith. The early church often baptized its converts on Easter Day, and the period of instruction in the Christian faith building up to Easter Day, a process known as Catechesis, was grounded on these creeds. One of the most famous examples of this kind of instruction is found in Cyril of Jerusalem's series of more than 20 catechetical lectures given in the 4th century to new believers who were preparing for baptism. So basically these creeds were summaries of the key points about the Christian faith. And another important point, which I mentioned earlier, was the fixing of the canon of the New Testament. The Greek word canon means a rule or a norm, and in effect it's saying these are the books of the New Testament. And this emerged during the patristic period. It was a process of consensus, and we know that some early Christians read books that did not find their way into the canon. For example, the Didache, a very short early Christian manual on morals and church practices. But nevertheless, there was wide consensus about this core group of texts that we now call the New Testament. Now, the point I like to emphasize is that many of the conversations and debates that were initiated during this first phase of Christian theology continue today. We still debate how to interpret Scripture. We still debate how to interpret the Trinity. We still debate how best to make sense of Jesus Christ. And there are 3 major debates that are referenced in this opening chapter. The first is the Arian Controversy about the person of Christ. Was he just a particularly eminent human being, or was he in some sense divine? Arius argued that Christ was a supremely good creature, but not divine. And Athanasius argued that the Christians' understanding of revelation and salvation were so closely interconnected with the divinity of Christ, this idea simply could not be removed without rendering Christianity incoherent, unraveling the New Testament's witness to his person and work. A second debate was the Donatist controversy. This was in the Western Church in Roman North Africa, and the issue here was to do with church membership. Is the church, in effect, a society of saints demanding purity, or, in effect, a mixed body of saints and sinners? We'll look at that in detail when we come to look at Augustine on the church. For Augustine, the church was a mixed body. Its ministry did not depend on the purity or the holiness of its ministers, but on the fact that they mediated Jesus Christ. And we'll look at those theological issues in more detail later. And the third debate is the Pelagian Controversy, which also focused on Augustine. This was all about the interplay of divine grace and human responsibility. Pelagius, in effect, had an ethic of self-perfection. You can make yourself holy. Augustine said, no, I'm sorry, you can't. You need the grace of God on our own. We struggle to make any improvement at all. Obviously, a lot more needs to be said about all of these, and more will be said at the appropriate point in this book. So that's a very brief overview of this first chapter, and I think you'll enjoy reading this. It will kind of orientate you, give you a sort of sketch map of some of the big issues of the period, and help you to realize how these conversations keep recurring in contemporary theology. And one point I need to make in relation to this chapter is that at the end of the work, there is a glossary which explains the technical words of Christianity, and also each of the work's opening chapters include lists of terms that have been introduced, so you can make sure you've picked up what they mean. Here's the list of terms introduced in this chapter, along with the page numbers on which you'll find them introduced. Again, this will help you learn the vocabulary as well as the concepts of Christian theology. Now, there's a lot more packed into this chapter than I've walked you through, and I think you'll get a lot out of reading it. Anyway, speak to you again soon when we move on to the next chapter, looking at theology during the Middle Ages. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.